So let me start with the bursting of the bubble.
Okay.
Japanese bubble was huge. During that period, of course, people felt rich, spent a lot of money, and then when the bubble burst, asset price started collapsing, and commercial real estate prices fell 87% nationwide.
Collapsed, basically.
China is sort of similar to Japan with rising asset prices and rising debt at the same time.
The private sector, corporate, and the household, they have to pay the debt.
我有的时候觉得房价永远不会下跌，突然有一天突然觉得房价永远不会上涨。
In the national economy, if someone is saving money or paying down debt, you better have someone on the other side borrowing and spending money. If everybody's paying down debt or saving, the economy will just contract. And it took myself 7 years to figure out that this was a balance problem, not a structural problem. When people go through this long period of debt repayment, they are so sick of this experience. They say to themselves, I will never borrow money again.
So now, for China, what do you see as government's policy? 今天呢，我们请来2位嘉宾，顾朝明先生、朱宁院长。我们今天主要是想谈一谈日本的经济为什么低迷了30年后呢，忽然间在这2年有很多的这个起色。第二部分，我们想聊一下日本的经验对于中国来讲，就目前的经济状况有什么启示啊？所以主要是这2方面的问题。那顾先生呢，我要特别介绍一下，他是日本野村证券研究院的首席经济学家。野村证券呢是日本最大的这个证券公司。那在90年代初期啊，我跟野村证券啊，当时社长我都见过面。当时野村证券都是这么介绍自己啊，就是我是野村证券的，我是日本最大的证券公司。那么同时我也是全世界最大的证券公司，所以这就是日本当时的这个非常的红火。但是呢，因为顾先生呢从小在日本、在美国长大，所以这个中文呢表达比较复杂的事情呢稍微有些问题，所以我们之间还是用英文来进行这个交谈。Let's get started on our subject. For Japan, you know, after so many years, some people say 30 years, after that bubble, real estate bubble and the currency appreciation, a lot of people say after the signing of the other agreement that pushed up Japanese yen, back in end of 80s.
1985.
1985.
September,
okay.
Yes.
Some 30 years have passed. I mean, the Japanese economy was sluggish. I mean, growth around 0. So what happened?
So let me start with the bursting of the bubble.
Okay.
Japanese bubble was huge. Commercial real estate prices, which led the bubble in Japan, went up 5 times in 5 years.
Which year and to?
From 1985 to 1990.
90.
So during that period, of course, people felt rich, spent a lot of money, so GDP was going up very sharply. And then when the bubble burst, asset price started collapsing, and commercial real estate prices fell 87% nationwide. Not just little corner of Tokyo.
Collapsed, basically.
So try to imagine that in China, Beijing is down 87, Shanghai down 87, Suzhou down 87, Shenzhen down 87. What kind of economy you got left here?
That's over an extended period of time.
For about 7 years period. But Japanese economy managed to keep its GDP from falling below the peak. It was always above the peak of the bubble. It was slow, as you mentioned, but it was always growing. So the first point about the Japanese economy was what happened in both corporate balance sheets, because with asset prices for 87%, corporate balance sheets are very much underwater. And why the GDP remained at those very high levels. When the bubble burst, all these people who participated in the bubble, and people participate in the bubble with borrowed money. So all that liability is still up there. Asset prices collapsed, so the balance sheet's underwater. Balance sheet's underwater means these guys are all bankrupt, but there are actually two kinds of bankruptcies. One with cash flow and one without cash flow. And at that time, most Japanese companies were still doing very well, selling cars, cameras, household appliances. So they have plenty of cash flow, but balance sheets deeply underwater. So what do you do if you're in that situation? Well, it doesn't matter whether you're Japanese or Chinese or American. What you do under those circumstances is to use the cash flow to pay down debt.
Okay.
Because as long as you have a cash flow, you can continue to pay down debt. Eventually, your balance sheets will be balanced again. And then you start maximizing profits again. You keep your mouth shut, quietly use all the cash flow to pay down debt. The problem is when everyone does this all at the same time, what happens to the national economy? And in the national economy, if someone is saving money or paying down debt, you better have someone on the other side borrowing and spending money. If everybody's paying down debt or saving, the economy will just contract. And in the usual economy, people like us in the financial sector will take money from the savers, give it to someone who can use it, make sure that this cycle is maintained. And if there are too many borrowers, interest rates are raised. Too few borrowers, interest rates are lowered to make sure that this cycle is maintained. But once a big bubble bursts and so many balance sheets underwater, central bank bring interest rates down to zero, everybody's still paying down debt. No one's borrowing money. Then the economy starts shrinking. This is what I call balance sheet recession. Japan fell into that after the bursting of the bubble. When you are in that situation, government has to borrow money. And the reason is that private sector individually are all doing the right things, repairing balance sheets. So you cannot tell the private sector, hey, please don't repair the balance sheets, because they'll have to do it anyway. If the private sector cannot change the behavior, the only way to save the economy is for the government to borrow that money. And basically, Japanese government borrow the money. In my view, not very efficiently, and sometimes in very stupid ways. But at least the government was there to keep the GDP from falling. So that's the first part of the Japanese story.
The private sector, corporate, and the household, they have to pay the debt, right? I mean, to deal with the balance sheet problems. The only one that's doing the job for GDP is the government.
Yes.
Okay, when they borrow money, what does the government do with the money to pump up the GDP?
Right. So let me give you a numerical example so that you know what the government is doing.
Okay.
In the ordinary economy, suppose I have $1,000 of income, and I spend $900 myself. This is already someone else's income, so that's not a problem. The $100 that I saved will go through people like us in the financial sector, give it to someone who can use it. That person borrows and spends $100, so 900 plus 100, $1,000 against my original income of $1,000. So economy moves forward, right? That's the usual economy. But in the balance sheet recession, I have $1,000 of income. I spend 900 myself, and I saved $100. This $100 gets stuck in the financial sector. It cannot come out because no one's borrowing money. So the economy shrinks from 1,000 to 900. The 900 is someone else's income. When that person gets this 900 and says, okay, let me save 10% and spend 810, 810 is circulating in the economy. But the $90 comes into the financial sector and gets stuck there because it takes a long time for private sector to repair balance sheets, depending on the size of the bubble. But because the Japanese bubble was so big, many, many years, actually 20 years altogether. So if you are not careful about this situation, economy can go from 1,000, 900, 810, 730 very, very quickly. And that's what happened during the Great Depression in the United States from October 1929. To stop this thing, the government has to borrow this $100 and spend it. Then it'd be 900 plus $100,000 and GDP is maintained. And that's basically the role Japanese government played throughout this period. The problem, however, is that when we enter the balance sheet recession, No one knew, including myself, that this is a balance sheet recession. At the beginning, we all thought this is just ordinary recession. Whatever the government wants to spend this $100, no one really cared as long as the economy is maintained. If they had known that this is going to take at least 10 years, they would have selected the project much more carefully. Okay. But they thought this is a short-term thing. Just borrow the $100, spend it. And then at that time, the economy stabilizes. But next year, the same thing happens. Yeah. No so-called Keynesian pump priming. So next year, the government comes in, do it again, and then the economy stabilizes. But the following year, the same thing happens. Why no Keynesian pump priming? Very simple. Private sector is still repairing balance sheets. Yeah. They could not respond to the government's stimulus. As a result, we ended up spending money on some very silly projects over all these years. Well, they had one road. They built another road next to it.
Okay.
And also we call it bridges to nowhere, roads to nowhere. Not all of them are bad. In fact, bad projects were not that many. But, you know, people in the media, but they all find these few bad ones and write big stories how much politicians are wasting money. And when that kind of talk start coming into the people's mind, they start saying, no, you don't want to spend that money. And that's what kept the Japanese government from spending more money more quickly to stop the balance sheet recession. After the first few years, the Japanese government could not spend the money because of the public outcry. And that basically slowed down the recovery, and that's why it took 20 years.
Since last year, probably a little bit the year before last, somehow things started to change, in Japan. So what happened?
Well, let me divide the period into two parts.
Okay.
For the first 20 years after the bubble, we were literally in balance sheet recession because companies were not borrowing money, they're all repairing balance sheets. But balance sheets were largely repaired about 10 years ago, 2012 or so. Companies were no longer paying down debt, they're beginning to borrow money. So that was good. But when people go through this long period of debt repayment, they are so sick of this experience, they say to themselves, I will never borrow money again. Americans who lived through the Great Depression never borrow money until they died because it was such a horrible experience. So that kind of kept the Japanese companies, even with the clean balance sheets, from borrowing money. Today, they're still not borrowing money. I look at this number, how much money Japanese companies are borrowing, and I will say, well, not exactly. We are not really out of the woods, which means the government still have to support this economy by borrowing and spending money. And that's still happening, unfortunately.
The economy is not expanding. If they don't borrow money, they don't invest. They don't expand their business.
They are expanding. They are beginning to invest in new products.
Okay.
But they are not borrowing money. So we have a wording in Japanese. It's called cash flow management. What that means in English is that if you have a certain amount of cash flow, you put some in the liquid assets, some is somewhat less liquid, and liquid assets to make sure that you get the maximum return on the cash flow you have. In Japanese, the same word, cash flow management, means do everything within cash flow. Don't borrow money, period.
So they are burned, basically.
Exactly. So last 10 years, companies began to invest, began to have new products, and that's all good. But macroeconomically, they are not borrowing enough, which is why the government still has to run deficit to keep the economy going.
I would imagine, for the past 20, 30 years, it's only one guy that's borrowing money. It's Japanese government. What about the debt level of Japanese government?
Whether that debt is bad for the economy or good for the economy, we should not look at the size of the debt alone.
Okay.
We have to look at the size of the savings, which so many people ignore. But once you look at the savings, then you compare the two. If the debt is exactly equal to the savings, then the economy will be moving forward.
Yeah.
If the debt is too large, then interest rates will be moving higher because people will be fighting for the remaining savings.
Yeah.
But if interest rates are coming down, that means even though debt might be large, savings is even larger. And we have in this situation for a long time. That's why Japanese interest rates have been so low for so long. And so, yes, the debt is large, but maybe it should be even larger to get the economy out of this mess.
朱教授，你对这个顾先生谈的这些目前日本30年前、30年后，你有什么评论没有？对他，特别是他那个资产花了这么长时间去修复那个资产负债表啊，这个。
因为我是研究行为金融的，我们原来在研究经济学的时候，我们做很多关于模型和数据，但是往往忽略了行为啊，
对，行为经济学，
它的很多。企业家的行为、消费者的行为，包括政府官员的行为，都随着时间有非常深刻的改变。就这个宏伟的叙事在发生非常根本的改变。原来有段时间觉得房价永远不会下跌，突然有一天觉得房价永远不会上涨。在我这个书《刚性泡沫》里，我们讲到，就是当然现在越来越多人承认我们在至少过去一段时间房地产是有泡沫的。那我写了《刚性泡沫》，也有人叫我说是中国的这个泡沫先生。但是我们看到有一点很重要，就是为什么会有泡沫？我经常跟很多人在解释，你就需要一点就可以造就一个泡沫：预期。你只要预计房价会涨或者股票会涨，我再怎么跟你讲这有风险，这有泡沫，你根本都不会听的。但这个的可怕之处恰恰在于什么呢？突然有一天大家都觉得房价不会再上涨。尤其是刚才郭先生讲到，日本的房地产的泡沫主要的推动者其实是商业房地产，在大陆地区其实更多的是住房的房地产。
住房。
我们国内的年轻一代，比如说95后、00后，我说有一个特别重要的关于我们中国房地产问题，我觉得可能我们现在仍然没有充分意识到，就年轻人啊，你看现在很多人不结婚、不要小孩、不买房子。但这里面很重要一个原因是什么呢？过去这4、5年，尤其是在房地产调控和疫情期间，我觉得年轻一代人经历了3个很重大的变化，咱们这代人没有经历过。第一个变化是什么呢？掏空了6个钱包买了房子，付了首付，房子交付不了。原来中国投资者觉得说，再怎么不行，我房子还在，我砖还在，我有个实体资产在手里面。后来发现付了钱未必能拿着。第二点呢，整个这个就业市场的压力和难度比原来大了很多。但是第3点，这是其实我在清华的学生，我在高金的学生都在跟我讲的。5年前没有买房的年轻人，回过头看他当时没有买房那个决定，他觉得自己好幸运，觉得自己好明智，
逃过了
这一次整个房价的调整。10年前这是不可想象，年轻人都觉得说，哎呦，当时没买房子，我实在是太错误了。对，现在觉得，哎呦，多亏了当年没有买房子，就是他的亲身经历教育他，房子并不是一个那么好的资产或者投资。
就刚才听到顾先生说的，就是你叫 self enforcement 啊，一朝被蛇咬，10年怕草绳。那顾先生也说了啊，就那 bubble 一下破灭了以后，你再去让这些日本人去借钱，他也不借了啊，就他怕了，真是被那次地产泡沫也害怕，所以花了20、30年在修复这资产，到今天，刚才郭院长还是不太愿意借钱，是吧？啊，这也不是太愿意借钱。看看日本现在的这个经验，对中国现在目前的情况有什么样的这个教训？
回到改革，这个咱们国内改革特别重要，就是还是我们必须得承认结构性的改革，因为有很多经济面临的问题是结构性的问题，不把根本上的这种结构性的问题解决，通过结构性的改革来解决，你的问题就一直在那儿。这个金融领域里面就说不要浪费任何一个危机，危机告诉你这儿有个问题，那你就要真正的下决心去解决这个问题。我们过去这30、40年的市场化改革里面，很重要的一个就是让所有的要素最后都由市场决定。但我觉得经过了这么久的这个改革之后，我觉得只有一个领域还没有很成功的完成这个改革是什么呢？ 是信贷和信用领域。你去银行贷款，银行首先会问你，你是国企还是民企啊？
哦，还是国企民企的问题。
对，其实最后能让市场觉得，不论你是国企民企，我看看你的经营水平，我看看你的利润水平，我看看你的今后发展战略，我来决定我怎么来分配你的这个信用，而不是说看你背后
所有制啊。
When we fell into balance sheet recession 34 years ago, no one had any idea what we were going through. Bank of Japan brought interest rates down to zero. Nothing happens. You put in the fiscal stimulus, no pump priming. You try the structural reforms to no effect. I mean, Japan did quite a bit of structural issues. Still, the economy is doing very poorly. And it took myself 7 years to figure out that this was a balance sheet problem, not a structural problem. So it was very difficult to convince people that when you are in this situation, where there's a situation called fallacy of composition, individually everybody's doing the right thing, collectively you get the wrong result. In this situation, the government has to come in. As a result, we wasted lots of time. Today in China, so many people already talking about balance sheet recession. So at least the disease is already known. The magnitude of the disease might not be so as bad as in Japan, but at least the disease is known, and you know what to do with it when it happens. So that's a huge advantage China has over Japan compared to 34 years ago. But there are things on the other side too. For example, Japanese population was still growing when the bubble burst and kept on growing for 19 years. Until 2009, when it finally peaked. So that 19 years, so-called deflation in Japan has absolutely nothing to do with demographics. However, in China, the population decline and the bubble burst are happening on the same year. But in the Chinese case, I think this is a serious issue because for Chinese people to come back to borrow money to buy apartments, they must get this notion that the prices from here will start going up. The adjustment that is needed for people to come back in will be much, much lower than in the Japanese case.
For Japan's experience of the last 30 years, the private sector is not borrowing money. The government has to step in. So now, for China, what do you see as government's policy to handle or to cope with the current economic growth, the problem? What do you see as some sort of a solution?
I understand that government is spending more money.
Yeah.
The question is whether that's enough. More government spending than probably better than less.
Okay.
That's one point. The other is that the government seems to be hoping through manufacturing, emphasis on manufacturing, that economy could take off from that side, not from the consumption side. But that alarms people outside China, that China may go for the export-driven growth. But just like Japan 30-some years ago, China is running the largest trade surplus in the world.
Yeah, yeah.
So if a country running the largest trade surplus in the world try to use export to get out of the recession, all the other countries will be very, very upset. And we experienced in Japan in early 1990. And China is in exactly the same situation, given what happened to Japan back in 1990, and that protectionism is already so prevalent in many parts of the United States and in Europe. For a country with a large trade surplus, it has to be domestic demand to come out of balance sheet recession.
At the moment, Japan's debt to GDP ratio is about 380, 390%. And for China, that ratio increased by 100 percentage points within a matter of 5 or 6 years, from 2010 through 2016. And it stayed at a fairly high level.
Fast.
And then, of course,
Who lent them the money?
It's mostly domestic debt. So the banks and some of the financial products. And then I think that's why starting around 2016, China started a wave of policy trying to stabilize the leverage ratio for the nation. But that's also leading to the slowdown in the economy.
Right, right.
Just like many other countries in the world, national leverage ratio increased again. In one way, I think China is sort of similar to Japan with rising asset prices and rising debt at the same time. In China, many people believe as long as I'm important enough, the government will eventually bail me out.
Oh.
So if I'm the largest SOE in the country, of course, the government cannot afford letting me down. Maybe similar thoughts went through the mind of Evergrande. Given that I'm the largest real estate developers in the country, how can you afford letting me down? But that's actually providing a perverse incentive for people to borrow beyond their means and speculate. So I was sort of
moral hazard problem.
Exactly. I was trying to use that to explain why housing and many other investments are just so speculative, because people are having this moral hazard issue in the deep mind of their thinking process. So
That's the guaranteed bubble you're talking about.
Yes.
You know, the current situation is really, everybody felt the pinch. Somehow they don't feel they're going to spend. The number comes out at 5%, this and that, everything is great. The people is really confused. You know, everybody feel pain. We are experiencing they call downgrading consumption. We will spend less. I mean, in every field. I mean,
So you don't feel like consumption is really picking up?
yeah, the numbers are there not matching. Somehow they feel this coming back of consumption, it's going strong or whatever.
Richard, forecast about the global economic growth.
I think advanced countries are facing this very difficult period of how to tighten monetary policy when there's so much excess reserves already in the system. This is the first time in history where we're faced with this problem, right?
Yep. I think there are so many things that humankind has never experienced.
Never experienced.
Exactly.
Yes, yes. And this one is the cost of QE, as it were.
Exactly. I totally agree.
This is the center of the campus.
I think this is the center of the campus. He studied at the Zhejiang University, which got rolled into Jiaotong University after.
St. John is part of. My mother is a graduate of
Is
St.
that
John.
right?
She's
Yes,
a
after
Shanghainese.
liberation. Yeah.
Oh.